understands the value of what civic technology can do. Currently, he is a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School, director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. But the piece of his career that's had the most influence on my career is he was the co-author of the book, The Responsive Cities, which really was what got me interested in the space. So we're lucky to have him from all the way from Harvard. So with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Stephen Goldsmith, Professor.
Good. You say the name of the book louder.
The Responsive City.
So
available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
Thank you very much. So it's important that you tweet your identity. It's more important that you tweet to your friends to buy the book. So I was going to talk without a PowerPoint, but this is Microsoft, and Adam reminded me that it's a requirement of a presentation. So we now have a PowerPoint, and we'll move through. Although my biggest complaint today about you
is
I have Windows 8, so Windows 10 is supposed to be free, right? Well, it's free to everyone except those who work at Harvard University. So I tried to figure out how I could bypass the administrative settings. Can you help me?
We'll talk.
All right. We got a lot of sophisticated technologists in the room, and I'm not in that group. My job at Harvard is to help cause government to change by using the tools and technologies that are available today, right? So I kind of try to evangelize what you do, connected to mayors and governors around the U.S. and to some extent around the world, and try to think about change. So I'm just going to talk about concepts here for a few minutes and a couple of examples. I am sensitive to the fact that we've done a lot of work both in the book and otherwise, and Chicago is either one of or the leader in bringing this all together in terms of both civic participation and the city. So a number of my stories are ones many of you already know about. But let me kind of go through this. We've not worked together before, so my assistant here will try to keep up with this. And we're going to go through the slides quickly because they were just prepared a few moments ago before the speech started. But, I just want to kind of put these up here. You all know all these concepts, but I've been in government for 30 years, and you can't appreciate the potential for change until you think about the technology tools that are available today. Even I stopped being deputy mayor for Mike Bloomberg 3-4 years ago, and even in the last 48 months, the technology changes have been so dramatic, and the ability to change government has been so great. It's not until you think about the ubiquity of mobile tools and cloud computing. And, I've been at this for so long that many of you may recognize this syndrome, right? Wherever I have a good idea, the CIO of an agency says, my system won't do that, or my system can't talk to that system, or whatever those kind of old cliches were. But now we have these data mining tools that make all of that, irrelevant, and that's all happened fairly dramatically. So that picture is just to say, when this stuff comes together, very dramatic. We'll talk about a number of the pieces as we go forward. Some of you introduce yourselves in terms of your interest in open data. Others introduce yourselves in terms of your interest in data analytics. Others introduce yourself in terms of kind of community data. So I have been thinking about this in the following way, right? So if we think about big data and data analytics, and I've got some stories about that, right? That just for purposes of making the picture easy, let's think about that as the enterprise data inside Cook County or the city of Chicago, right? How do we mine that data to make good decisions? But there's an awful lot of data out there in the community as well, right? And one of the goals of big data analytics is not to make, and I say this not in a pejorative sense, but the goal is not to make bureaucrats more sure that they know what's in everybody else's interest by not needing to listen to them because they have big data, right? Because you can imagine that would be what would happen, right? Now I've got data, and I've been trained in this professional vertical, and I really know what's in everybody else's best interest. So I'm trying to think about how public value is produced when the data from the community is integrated with the data from the enterprise, if you will, and leads to better services and better outcomes. Now, many of you have read about this story, but it's a couple years old, but it helps me kind of tell what I think the power is here. So I was in New York City, Hall, and a family died family of 4 died in a fire from a building that had been illegally converted, like they have in Chicago or Indianapolis or other places. And I had anticipated what the next question would be from the Post or the Daily News about how many times did you receive complaints about that building, right? So I called the buildings department that reported to me and said, have you ever had a complaint about that building? And they said, yeah, but we get whatever the number was, 30,000 complaints a year. And I called the fire department, went through the same drill, and they said, yeah, but we get 50,000 complaints a year. We went out there once, and we're going to get back to doing it. So in other words, they were kind of doing their job. And so in the back of City Hall was a guy we wrote about in the book, a guy named Mike Flowers, which I think he had some clandestine background, which he never volunteered in the same type of guy. So he said, just give me 60 days, right? And so during that 60 days, he took 311 data, 911 calls, tax delinquencies, mortgage foreclosures, date that the building was built, and one other data set, which I don't remember. And he looked at those and said, came back and said, I can predict which one of those reports will lead to a fire. I can increase the predictability by 1,000%. Right, so now you've got 300 buildings or 500 buildings. You assign a team of a firefighter and a buildings inspector, and you go out and remediate the problem before the family dies rather than after the fire starts, right? So we manufacture government, right? The same way we manufacture widgets like, 70 years ago, right? We do the set of activities that we think produce outcomes, but they don't really produce outcomes. They're really just activities. So let's go back and ask, what are the outliers, right? And how do we reallocate the resources of government towards those outliers?
Did I go one step too?
Well, I want to go fast, but not that fast. This is just the same principle, right? The number of parolees everywhere is going up. And we have big caseloads, child welfare caseloads, parole caseloads, probation caseloads. The way those cases are assigned, the way the parole officers are trained leads to not very good results, right? So a fellow at Warden, a data scientist at Warden, working with the parole department, identified parole officers, the quality of the parole officers, the characteristics of the parolees. Right, this is pretty easy to figure out, right? There's a set of parolees that are likely to recidivate, a set of parolees that aren't, and a set of parolees in the middle, right? And let's allocate the cases based on that and to the individuals that make the most sense. So you can do the same in other areas. This is just one more, and I've got dozens of these stories, but please buy the book to read the rest of them. But, have we said that enough times? Yeah, you got that enough?
We're going to say it again.
Okay, thanks. This is a similar story, and everyone in the room would kind of appreciate the whole concept here, which is predictive analytics and prescriptive analytics can dramatically change the way cities work. This fellow was Department of Finance, a guy named David Frankel, great fellow. Cities, I'm not sure New York was quite as fiscally challenged as Chicago, but nevertheless felt pretty fiscally challenged. And David came up one day and said, every auditor I hire produces X dollars in new revenue, so we want to hire more auditors. And we had a hiring freeze, so the answer was no, even though it would produce more revenue. He said, let's go back and try this differently, right? So if you think about this, it's the same principle again, but you can do it everywhere in government, which is, well, how would we increase the productivity or yield of the tax collectors, if you will, if we can't have more tax collectors? And the answer is pretty simple. We'll do a set of predictive analytics, and we will increase the quality of the cases selected to be audited, right? So a much higher percentage of those cases will yield results. And conversely, right, fewer people who are honest taxpayers will be harassed by tax inspectors who got their cases in a less scientific way, and the yield of that went up dramatically, right? So if we're doing waste, fraud, and abuse, we're doing tax collection, we're doing parolees, we're trying to predict the next fire. Like, think about how dramatically we can change the way government works in any category. So that's the data analytics, concentrating on the outliers. Yes. Now, those are my notes for the speech before you made me use the PowerPoint. Can I see those? Just to see what I meant to say. All right, so let me change gears a little bit here in the following way, right? So, progressive government. Think about not government in terms of its ends, but its means, right? So we have Tammany Hall 100 plus years ago. mayors are corrupt, you know, they hire their friends, they hire their relatives, they give contracts to their buddies. So we have what's called progressive government, and the way when we think about progressive government is we're going to have a set of rules that make it difficult for people to abuse their discretion, right? And so what we have done then is the way we have prevented the abuse of discretion is by eliminating discretion, right? So if you have no discretion, you cannot abuse it. So if you're a really good employee, it's very difficult to be good. If you're a really bad employee, it's very difficult to be bad. But we've moved everybody in the center. So this is the definition of red tape, which is we follow a set of rules, irrespective of whether those rules produce a good outcome, because that's how we define accountability, right? But people, they don't live in the transportation department, right? They don't live in the parks department. They live in a neighborhood. So government is organized vertically, but people live horizontally, right? So if we're going to solve problems, and particularly collaborative problems, we're going to have to figure out how to do that differently. So how do we break out of those hierarchical, it's almost, right, there are verticals and there are horizontals, and people, public employees are collected in the center, and how do they use their discretion differently? So I'll get to this in a second. I have another anecdote I want to tell. No, I don't have that slide. It's in my notes, though. So if you don't mind, I have a few more New York stories. So I used to go out, since I'm from Indianapolis, not New York City, and I was pretending I knew New York City, right? So I go out 6 times a week for meetings with community groups, 6:30, 7:30, 8:30 in the morning, Thursdays and Fridays. And groups, small groups of 15 people would come around, and they would just tell their stories, right? And it was really interesting in 2 ways. One, when person 1 would express an issue that they thought was important to government, person 5 would say, well, I didn't realize that was happening, and then they would offer a suggestion, right? And so the 2 things happened. One is the socializing of the problem, even among the group of people who live in the same neighborhood, always yielded solutions. The second was I found these ridiculous things that we were doing to people in those communities. So 3 weeks in a row, small restaurateurs, now this is not Manhattan, these are the outer boroughs, would say, I've gotten very expensive fines from the food inspectors, and all 3 of them in those 3 weeks said because they found that my cheese was too warm, right? Because cheese is supposed to be 41 degrees and it was 44 degrees or something like that. Leave aside the fact there's pasteurized cheese and it's out anyway, but irrespective of that, they were getting big fines. I went back to the health commissioner, and said, this is ridiculous. Can't you give some discretion to your inspectors? To which he said, well, if we give them discretion, how do we know they want to use it correctly? How do we know they want to use it? Now, this is kind of my point about progressive government, so I said, I guess that's right. And then I thought about it for a minute. I said, that's not right at all. It's really not right at all. They have iPads. They have GPSs in their iPads. We know how long they've been in each restaurant. We can figure out the outliers, who's written what type of infraction, for what type of issue, who didn't write an infraction, how many did they do in a day, right? And you can begin to analyze those. So I would suggest that this definition of accountability that says we're going to make sure that public employees who are dedicated civil servants can't use their discretion is outdated. And now we can allow them to use their discretion, but we can evaluate how they use their discretion for management purposes. And I've got a couple more examples. This slide is on a totally different issue, but it's very attractive. Anyway, this was a kind of a different point, right? If some of you have, I don't know, I'm not here to criticize Chicago, but in other cities like New York and Indianapolis, you've been known to see a street crew kind of drive over a pothole to go fill a pothole. Right? And you think that they're not doing their job. But in fact, they get a list of potholes in the morning and they go fill them, and they have a task order system that they use. Well, this is Boston, and Boston was the first city in a significant way to use an iPhone Android app to report you take a picture of the pothole, send it in through one center, but then the picture goes to the field worker. But then they added to that the fact that we're going to give our work crews the authority and discretion to stop and fill these holes along the way if they think it's appropriate, but take a picture of it. We got a GPS on it, we have a picture of it, we know where you've stopped, we know how you're using your extra time, and now we can manage the process. So this result, coupled with the following really interesting issue that Boston did, which is if the worker in Boston, in some circumstances now, can actually send a note back to the resident who filed the report saying, I'm John, I fixed your hole, right? I'm John, I did X, right? So now we create a relationship between the resident who doesn't think the government does anything in the first place, which is actually inaccurate, and the employee who feels kind of beat up. And these are just some of the results that happened in Boston. That days deliver recycling bins dropped, burned out lights dropped. I mean, so there's just a sense of responsiveness is quite different. Let me just speed up my presentation. Okay, so now let me talk about this for a second, because I think this actually is the future in combining all the tools. I've been involved in or around or complaining about child abuse for, well, all 30 years, if you will. And there's maybe no job more difficult than that of a child protective service worker who goes into a tough home and has to make a decision about whether to remove a child. Very, a lot of emotion, a lot of difficulty, a lot of danger. Well, up until recently, right, they took in like their notebooks with pieces of paper. And then in a grant from Annie Casey to the state of Indiana, they took the paper, they obviously digitized the paper, and they provided tablets to everybody. So now that feels like a breakthrough, but that's kind of that's a relatively boring breakthrough, right? So we've now taken massive amounts of paper into massive amounts of digits, and we still have a difficult circumstance. And the young caseworker has to exercise her discretion pretty quickly. So what data does she have available? Previously, because of the verticals, right, what if the child missed school? Well, most of those child protective service workers didn't know when the child missed school. What if the child's sibling had a broken arm like the child did a week before? That data wasn't available. And then in addition to that, and the next step that they haven't gotten to yet, would be to use the talents of the people in the room, which are, we ought to use data analytics against those databases to predict behaviors for the folks in those circumstances, not to make decisions, but to advise and improve the discretion of the caseworker, right? And then we can find out whether the outcomes follow the predictive analytics. And so the future, right? Now there's a lot of privacy issues, but these are a little different than public. These are child protection service workers who have authority over that particular child. We'll have a privacy conversation in a minute, because it's a really important issue. But if you think about it, right? I was state's attorney before I was mayor, and I tried to do this with pieces of paper. And I found the following interesting thing. The school superintendent would say his social workers in the schools would be better off if they had the juvenile probation records, and but he didn't trust the juvenile probation officers to see his information, and the police officers were the same way. So everybody said my guys could do a better job, but I don't really trust the other guys to get the information, right? So if we figure out who's allowed to have information, drive the information to the person making the decision, think how life changes. So now we've gone from employees who are not allowed to use their discretion to employees whose discretion is aided. We've gone from employees who are doing the same thing every day, inspecting a building, to employees who are using data to go after the buildings most likely to hurt folks, or to burn down, or a crime to occur. And so we can dramatically repurpose the resources of government. What's next? Now, oh, by the way, I don't want to talk too much in front of you. Where's the Illinois census? So.
Right in front of you.
Oh, so you know more about this than I do, so just don't, correct my story. So I'm quite serious about that. In addition to the important work that MacArthur's doing on jails, there's a whole issue about corrections departments, prisons that have lots of people in them, and more than they should. But over and above that, if you think about the following, a Department of Corrections has a set of levers that they can use, right? They classify a prisoner. They decide if he's maximum or minimum security. They decide if he has workforce training or faith-based training or GED or whatever, right? And there's limited resources, or drug therapy. There's limited resources in each one of those. Now, Indiana has started a project with Predictive Analytics to look and figure out characteristics of the offender, characteristics of the program, recidivist characteristics, right? And they're actually finding out that people released early who've completed certain programs recidivate much less frequently than those that don't. So it's not much, kind of a time to failure, much more complicated set of data. But the point is that we can now do evidence-based programming, right? Whether it's the drug treatment program or the workforce program or the mental health program, we can figure out which programs work for which sorts of folks, and then we have resources we didn't previously have. And you can do that over, so if you think about kind of performance contracting as well. So now, last, quickly, what are the last slides there? Oh, okay, thank you. So the last area I want to cover, and just take a minute, is the following, right? So I don't think we want to leave today, certainly my work's not about how government can merely respond to complaints from its citizens, right? Because the definition of democracy really isn't passive citizens of the state asking for more government services. That's really not the inherent nature of citizenship. So how do we think about the participation of citizens and their government? How do we think about the way budgets are made? How do we think about the way people listen to problems? You know, I've been at this long enough that I'll tell you the definition. Now that I'm no longer running for public office, I will tell you the definition of a public meeting. It's the following. You go back to your office, you decide what you want to do. Then you send the head of the agency or the mayor or the governor or somebody to a public meeting. He or she is then yelled at for 4 hours, right? And then goes back and does what they were going to do anyway, right? So that's a definition of engagement. And that's a really weird definition of engagement, not just because of a definition about how people listen, but a definition of who comes to the meeting, who's got the loudest voice. Is that really the definition of democracy, right? So now the question is, how do we use community engagement tools and social media, not just to find a way to complain about your pothole, but to socialize a problem, to identify an issue, right? So, you know, Chicago 311, the new Chicago 311 will look at 311 as a platform for engagement, not as a place just to complain. You could be in a neighborhood and not even know your neighbor complained about the same issue, let alone wanting to get together to clean up the vacant lot on a Saturday afternoon or whatever the case may be. So I want to begin to think about how third-party data, whether it's on the inspection side or third-party data, speaking of inspections, just briefly, my New York cheese story has been solved in Chicago, right? Because Chicago is the first city in the country to begin to use data to allocate inspection resources in restaurants. And it's a very dramatic change in the way we regulate, right? So trying to look at the outliers in terms of health, and you can do the same thing if you want in terms of outliers, in terms of taxes or whatever the case may be. So this is just third-party data. What me, but, you know, my whole job now that I'm no longer a public official is to tell stories about public officials and take credit for what they do. This is just how we ought to merge Yelp data and restaurant data, which is San Francisco is the first one to do that. Thanks. Lastly, there were, maybe not lastly, almost lastly, there were several of you whose job in the audience is visualization, and a couple of you have talked about open data. So I was involved in the early days of open data, and the definition then was, we're going to get as many agencies to put up unusable, ugly data as possible so they can check their mark and say they've done open data and they can move on to something more important. That was the earlier definition of open data, right? So this is just to make a point. This is Palo Alto's budget. And these are, obviously this is a PowerPoint and not, there's no hyperlinks in here. But the budget year over year and area by area and activity by activity is live inside that. So the budget information of Palo Alto is not really, it might be open to those of you who are clever data scientists in the room, but if you want the average citizen to use it, it has to be visualized. And so absent visualization, open data is not really open data. It can't be used in a broad way, and that's the point of that slide. So let's keep going. This is just to make a point I did before. This is New York City 311. We receive 20 million calls a year and responded to some of them. Yeah, it's not part of my refrain when I work there. And so, but I wanted the communities to engage around the 311 issues because there's great information in those 311 data sets. So we created this little map, and a lot of folks are doing this now. This is a couple of years old. The size of that yellow dot is the number of complaints at that location, right? The more yellow, the more problems. But then we went out and we trained, and Smart Chicago is doing a lot of that here. And we trained the community board presidents throughout New York how to use the software to figure out when did the complaint come in, how long did it take to get solved, what other types of complaints happen. And the agencies were worried that it would just lead to people complaining more often. But here's what happened, right? Those 6 meetings I used to have weekly when those folks got together, they got together now in an informed way. So one woman called in and said, from the community board president, said, you know, I just figured this out. You guys have all these pedestrian accidents or near misses in our community at this intersection. He said, you know, the reason why you do, I just saw it, is because the senior citizen's home is on one side of the street, the pharmacy is on the other side of the street, and your Department of Transportation will not set the lights to accommodate the seniors walking from one side to the other, right? Because they say it's not kind of in their technical manual, right? So she came up with a solution and she could visualize the solution. She saw the number of accidents, and she called to say, so I wanted to think about actionable shared data as the foundation, right, for co-production of public services, and change the way we think about the relationship between communities and their cities. That will enhance trust will enhance the civic spirit, and then cities can do even bigger and greater aspirational things. So that's pretty much the drill. Except for this. Adam and I and several of you in the room today spent much of this today. Chicago is a leader in Internet of Things activities between Argonne and the University of Chicago and the city of Chicago, clearly the leaders in the country. And I just put this up here because every year for the next 10 years we're going to dramatically change the way governments work. Right? We're going to move traffic more quickly because we're going to have sensor data that will time the lights, as many do now. We're going to identify water breaks earlier because the pipe's going to tell us that it is about to leak before it leaks, right? We're going to be able to have a better sense of kind of communities where the air quality is creating too much asthma because the sensor is there. New York City has got what's called Link NYC. They're putting out 7,000 interactive kiosks throughout all of New York that support gigabit free wireless, which will have sensors on top of them and information for citizens as well. And so you can't really talk about, I talked about data up to the kind of IoT issue, but it's alive and well and more active in Chicago than anywhere else, and it's worth mentioning. So if you bring all that together, my only proposition here today is government yesterday is dramatically different than government tomorrow. We've got the tools to do a hugely different, transformative job. We can make a difference in people's lives with the same, no matter if you're Republican or Democrat or liberal or conservative, we ought to be able to agree that we ought to at least spend the dollars we have effectively. I mean, just kind of like the beginning point, right? So does the program work? Can we identify the outliers whose lives can we change? We have those tools. It takes leadership, right? Because